All right. Looks like we've got a pretty full group already. Excellent. Okay. It's kind of, it's kind of like popping popcorn when people come on. It starts a whole bunch of people at first, and then we get one here, one there, one here. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and get started for the sake of time. I'm Eric Jensen, the facilitator for the ADV work group, and got another full agenda today. If you look at the agenda, and I assume you've seen the agenda before you got on, the main thing we want to talk about today are the sustainable funding opportunities for the ADV program. So we'll have some presentation of what came out of the interviews that Kate did earlier this summer, as well as the survey that most of you filled out between meetings. And Josh will talk a little bit more about sustainable funding opportunities, and then we'll move into a work group discussion about that. And we will have a bio break on or about 2 o'clock. Followed by continuation of the discussion, and then community input at 2:45, and then next steps and adjournment. So next slide. As always, we have the contact information up here for anyone who needs it. My contact information as a facilitator is up there in case you have any questions about the facilitation process in these meetings. And then Kate McCusker is also on there in case you, as well as Josh Mulholland, and in case you have more substantive questions. So moving on, I think by now all of you have seen this slide many times, but just want to remind you that as workgroup members, please use your raise the hand feature to speak. I know those of you that were doing the hybrid last time were using name tents. If you were there in person, the name tent does not work for this, only the electronic hand. So, and I will call on people in order, as always, except for DSL staff, who I'm assuming will be responding to something pertinent to what's being said at the moment, or follow-up questions. But when it's your turn to speak, just remember that to introduce yourself when you speak, so everybody knows who you are, and we request, as always, for you to be respectful of each other. Next slide. For those of you who are here from the community, not part of the work, not on the work group, just want to remind you, if you didn't know already, that these meetings always include a portion for you to be able to give public comment, and so that'll be toward the end of the meeting. The meeting information and materials are always posted a week in advance on the DSL website, so you can get that information, as well as there are recordings of these meetings too. And then in early 2024, DSL is going to be opening up a comment period for community members to be able to talk about or respond to a ADV program framework. So, and I'll turn it to Josh at this point.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. First of all, happy holiday season to everybody. Here's the schedule for the next few meetings. We were careful to avoid taking up too much of your time between now and the end of the year, but we will be coming back together on January 9th to work through and discuss the draft program policy framework that staff is currently working on now and will be through the next couple of weeks. That should reflect the ideas and concerns identified by the work group. We'll then talk about specific areas that need to be included in a legislative concept at that late January meeting. And then we're going to see what makes the most sense for attention for those last two scheduled meetings as that time approaches. I don't want to put those agendas together without fully understanding yet where we need to devote our time. You can advance the slide, please. So as was mentioned, today's topic is all about looking at sustainable funding options for the state's program. I intentionally left this as the sole big topic today, just to ensure that we were able to get through hopefully quite a few different ideas, and also think about some pros and cons of those ideas. What groups might support a certain funding stream, what groups might not. I don't want this conversation to feel rushed. I know we've tried to pack so much in a short period of time. So anyway, that's my plan, at least for today. So as always, I'd like to start with a recap of what we heard this summer. First of all, I would say the need for a sustainable funding source or sources was pretty much universally identified. But that's where I'd say the unanimous responses ended. Many people supported the idea of the program being supported by those that make, use, somehow profit from, sell boats. But there were also some that identified that a statewide problem that may directly or indirectly adversely impact everyone should potentially be paid for in a way that does reflect that broader impact. Some other notes here. We did hear opposition to the continued use of common school fund dollars being used to remove and address ADVs. And that is consistent with the direction provided by the State Land Board and the main reason why this group was created and exists. When we talk about those things that should be off the table, that is one from my point of view, from our point of view, that very much is off the table. So not surprisingly, there was general displeasure with the idea of those that do not feel like they are contributing to the problem, that they should have to contribute to the solution. That's not surprising. We heard that quite a bit. And as referenced in the last two bullets, people think that there is available federal funding to support the program, and I would agree. And that should absolutely be pursued, but that cannot and should not be viewed as the sole sustainable funding for this program. And that's a sentiment that I also agree with. Kate, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Because during the summer, we weren't specifically asking some questions about the sustainable funding sources, a survey was sent out last week to get some prompts for today's discussion, really. I just wanted to hear what ideas that you had floating all around so we can start organizing those, get people thinking about them, and then put them to the group for a broader discussion. The pie chart on the screen now shows some high-level summary stats from that survey that was completed by many people on the work group. I appreciate you doing that, by the way. I do want to note that the language on this slide and the next slide is taken directly from responses and does not necessarily reflect my thoughts or understanding. So on some of these, don't ask me to explain the thinking behind them. I just wanted you to see what your peers were thinking when prompted with these questions. So anyway, over half of the respondents supported the idea that funding should come from users, either through registration fees, launch fees, commercial boat fees, some sort of upfront purchase tax or excise tax. A smaller portion of folks supported the use of general fund dollars. Someone said income tax, kind of the same thing. While submerged land leases were brought forward by a few, insurance assessments, which I'm not completely even sure on the genesis of that or what that means, that was brought up. And then there were some other ideas brought forward. Fuel tax was brought up as something to look at as well. So if we can go to the next slide real quick. If you remember from the survey, I asked, what sources should be on the table, and then which of those should be off the table. And again, these are language from the responses and not necessarily edited by me. The main takeaway that I wanted you to take from this, and the point I'm trying to make, is these lists are fairly identical. And I can safely say that there's not unanimous agreement on how to address this very crucial aspect of the program. There were those that feel that user fees absolutely should be on the table, and those that feel like they shouldn't. Same thing with general fund dollars. Same thing with where, how grants might fit in. So again, I just want to point out that there's some disagreement on this topic, and I'd like to work through some of that today. I don't think that we're going to identify this perfect funding solution that we all agree on. but I'd like to hear some robust discussion on some different directions to go, and then what that opposition and support might look like. As we, consider that with as staff, and then we consider what our ultimate proposal to the land board and eventually the legislature might look like. I want to have a good sense of the pros and cons kind of, up front to bring forward to those powers that be. So to the last slide that I have before I kick it back to you, Eric. So as a jumping off point to today's meeting, I'd like to start and see if there are assumptions that we can all agree on before we start getting into the weeds on some of these sources. There are two on the screen that I feel relatively safe in saying we might all agree on. But I'm happy to even have that challenged, but I'm also happy to add to this list. So before we get into who should pay what through what mechanisms, how, I'd like to make sure that there are things in the background, are there assumptions that we can all agree on? So again, tell me my two on the screen are silly, and that's fine. I'd love to hear justification for that. Or what else should be included on this list as a common baseline, if you will, that we can all start from. So Eric, I'm going to give it back to you just to make sure this list is filled out to the agreement of the work group.
Thanks, Josh. As Josh pointed out, I mean, these are two assumptions that came out of both the interviews and the survey. The question is, are there other takeaways of assumptions that we can use going forward, or that DSL can use going forward, and sort of setting that proposal for a sustainable funding framework. And so, we'd like to get a little bit of discussion about that first, and then I'd like to circle back and talk more specifically about different options for sustainable funding. But if we can kind of hone in initially on what are the things that are baseline assumptions with regard to sustainable funding, that would be great. And Mike, you are first, sir.
So I'm going to start off by beating this drum again real quick. I can tell you from my perspective, and I know we're talking today about sources of funding, but I don't really support any taxpayer or user fees without the discussion of, and I know it'll be a later discussion, of holding folks responsible for doing what they're doing. So I just want to kick it off with that, because I know it's not a favorite subject, and I know we've talked about it a little bit, but I don't think it's right. I'm one of those that you're going to put more user fees on the folks that are paying insurance, and they're responsible to pay for those that aren't responsible, and then we're not going to hold them responsible. So that's my first comment. And there's lots of stuff.
Yeah, don't go away, Mike, because I want to follow up on that. And so when you talk about holding folks responsible, I've got two questions here. One is just a clarification. And so what I'm assuming that you're saying is, by holding people responsible, is the enforcement end with regard to the fees. Is that and regulations? Is that true?
Yeah. The enforcement into, if you dump a boat and you own this boat, you're going to be charged with a felony. You're going to be charged with a misdemeanor. You're going to be fined. Some type of mechanism to hold folks responsible, because I think we've heard it loud and clear from the folks that do this every day, that folks dump this and they walk away laughing, and the taxpayers are stuck with millions of dollars of cleanup fees to deal with these vessels, and they walk scot-free. And I don't think we can have one without the other. And I know that the hardest one to deal with is holding people responsible, but I think we need both topics.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying with regard to both topics. Now I'm going to circling this back to the base assumptions here in a second, but I wanted to ask you, are you saying that the enforcement piece and whatever sustainable funding piece gets traction, can happen at the same time, or that enforcement has to happen first and then you're willing to talk about sustainable funding options?
I would say enforcement first and then sustainable funding options. We need to get at the harder piece, and I think that's the harder piece. I think once we deal with that, I think we can look at taxpayers and users with a straight face when we say, look, you're going to be paying a little more, or you're going to help pay for these folks, but guess what? They're going to be held responsible. It's not easy to say, look at them with a straight face and say, they're going to do this. And oh, by the way, it costs $100,000 to clean up their mess, and they weren't held legally responsible or financially responsible for any of it.
Okay, so before I toss a question back to the rest of the group, and then we'll get to Abby's point. The first bullet that we had with an assumption is that across the board, people agreed that sustainable funding was necessary for the ADV program. Are you in agreement with that?
I agree with that.
Okay, all right. So great. So does anybody have a feeling about this approach with regard to addressing enforcement prior to sustainable funding? Okay, we'll circle back on that a little bit later. Abby? I think you're on mute, Abby.
Yes, I am. I took a vacation. I forgot how to use the computer. So, which is a good thing. I guess I want to dive maybe things that might be assumptions. And one I'd like to put out there is that there might be a difference between the existing stock of ADVs and future ADVs. Because I don't know how we're going to get user fees to pay for everything that's here and is stockpiled. So I put that as a possible assumption that there might need to be two mechanisms, whether they're sustainable funding and or enforcement, that might need to have parallel tracks. And I'm going to similarly put on the table a possibility that there might be a difference for type of vessel. I'm a boat owner. I have a sailboat. I feel like it would be easier to hold me accountable for a boat that I register, have insurance on, etc., versus one of these, Saccharissa or Alert boats that are a very different scenario. So I think we might need to think of assumptions that are a little more specific for some specific subcategories. And then I'll just add a comment to what was brought up. And I think we probably need sustainable funding and clear enforcement simultaneously. I don't know that we have the time because the funding's going to take a while. So I think we need them both, and we need to figure how all of this becomes a comprehensive approach, because I think the whack-a-mole approach has not served us to date.
Thank you for that clarification in response to the other idea that Mike brought up. Abby, before you go away, follow-up question with regard to the first piece that you were talking about in terms of sustainable funding, and I think what you were suggesting, I want to make sure that we have clear understanding, is that there's going to be a lot of work up front, and then there's going to be more kind of maintenance later. So you may have a lot of upfront costs at the beginning. Is that what you're saying? And then as things even out, it might be a little different?
I would say yes. I don't think I would call it upfront as much as sort of addressing the backlog versus addressing future potential ADVs.
Yeah. And so what is your thought then? Well, okay, I'm going to make a note to come back when we start talking about specifics, because I do want to kind of not wrap up, but at least bring to some kind of closure on the assumptions. So other than the two assumptions that were brought up, it sounds like you're in agreement with that, but that's a point that you're bringing up related to how the money rolls out from the start and into the regular program. So, all right, thank you, Abby. Appreciate that. Mark?
Thank you, Mark Landauer. I'm with the Oregon Public Ports Association. You know, the question that I agree with both Abby and Mike about the enforcement and sustainable funding have to go hand in hand. Completely agree with Mike Dunning's statement that really hard to go and ask for money when you're not holding the polluter responsible in any way, shape, or form. So I do tend to be sympathetic with that. However, my question really gets to the heart of what does sustainable funding mean? Okay, because we frankly, we have an identified problem. There are a bunch of ADVs out there, and there are probably going to be more over time as the fleets become older and less reliable, and fishing opportunities perhaps diminish or whatnot, God forbid. But what I need to know really is what is meant by sustainable funding. Does that mean that we're taking care of the backlog, as Abby suggests, a full-on, massive investment up front and then tapering it down over time to address the recurring ones? What I'd like to hear from DSL and what knowing the history of funding that has happened over the course of the last, say 5 years or 10 years, what do they consider to be sustainable funding? Thank you.
Let's take a moment, go to Josh for just a second. Josh, do you want to respond to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. As far as sustainable funding and the definition for that, I am considering a source that is established that will prop up the program in the short and the long term. But you asked a better question, I think, about the realistic goals of the program, and I'm happy to get into that now the way I see them. We're aware of this backlog, and by the way, Abby, I think you made a great point in that, the program is maybe it's an assumption we put up there that the program must be multifaceted. It must be backwards looking and also forward facing. A part of it is always going to be, removals, but part of it also really needs to be steps to try to get ahead of this to prevent, having to remove all these boats going forward. But back to your question, Mark, I see the problems with legacy boats, if you want to call them that, as pretty vast, as not something that can realistically be achieved with some very short-term effort. I think that is inevitably going to be part of the program in the beginning and forever. As you correctly pointed out, boats just keep getting older and older. As we address some, there will certainly be others. Certainly the program needs to take steps to try to intervene or mitigate that. And that's one facet of the program. But I think it's, for me, it'd be folly for the group to say, hey, with just some massive influx of one-time funding, we can get ahead of all this, and then it's in a kind of a maintenance mode. I would encourage folks to not look at it that way, because I think it's just a little bit naive. And also because the amount of funding, upfront funding, if you want to call it that, needed to address that, I think is just politically infeasible. Nor am I necessarily saying that that's the best way that the state should spend a massive amount of money in 2023. I'm not going to opine one way or another, but I think those are my expectations for what this would look like in the short and long term.
Great, thank you, Josh. And what I'm kind of seeing here, I'm trying to get back to the assumptions for a second. What I'm hearing between all of you that have spoken so far, including Josh, is that when it comes to sustainable funding, there should be an inherent assumption, if you will, that it's both short-term and long-term. It is encompassing both when we're talking about it. Is that fair, Josh?
Yeah, sorry. Absolutely. I think that's fair.
Great. We'll come back to that. So, Steve? Sergeant,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Engler, Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. There may be some misconceptions out there. One, the accuracy in the alert. It sounded like there was an assumption that we didn't know who the owners were in that case. Those vessels were owned by Walt James under a nonprofit that dissolved after basically his death. And the feds wouldn't do anything with the removal or the transportation of those vessels to a safer place until they ended up in a situation where they were sunk. And $7.2 million later, Metro and the state paid those bills with the assistance of the Coast Guard. That and one other misconception we have out there, that the polluters are not your normal person that pays their taxes, that registers their cars. Most of the polluters out there are criminals. And we have a very difficult time with the enforcement aspect just because of the nature of what they're doing, and being able to track down the owner that goes back 4 or 5 previous owners, sometimes 2 to 3 decades, becomes very difficult. So there's an enforcement piece there I totally agree with, but we've got to understand the fact that, again, these folks are not your typical do-good citizen that are waterway users.
Yeah. Thank you, Sergeant, for the clarification there. That's, I'm sure, is helpful background. I'd like to turn to Aaron.
Thank you. Aaron Bretz from the Port of Newport. So this is just this I don't think would be a main source of funding, but there's a couple of different aspects to it that I think would be beneficial overall to the problem. And that's fees. This won't be popular for some folks, but fees associated with the manufacture of boats within the state of Oregon. And the reason why I mention that is because it would create a more cradle to grave life cycle, or a cycle of supply, because the people who are leaving the boats out in the environment are not the ones who are introducing those materials into the environment. The manufacturers are. So as long as manufacturers can exclude from their overall business model, or as long as they generally exclude from their business model disposal of the materials they use in the manufacture of vessels, they don't have as much of a motivation to pick materials that are easy to dispose of. So one of the goals of this would be to try and tie those things together better. And you could do it either by way of fees, or give manufacturers the option to participate in a vessel turn-in program. So they could get involved on the backside of the supply cycle and dispose of vessels in lieu of paying a fee when they manufacture them. Now, the danger of doing this is it all has to do with the numbers, because it's not like the boating. You could do this with sales of new vessels too, and then include out-of-state manufacturers and say, well, if you will help us dispose of some vessels from in the state as part of a turn-in program or something like that, or a disposal program for abandoned vessels, that you would allow them to go ahead and do that. But you got to watch it, because we don't want to make ourselves come up with this thing that makes boats in Oregon more expensive than in other states, because then we'll have a major economic. It disincentivizes people to build and buy boats in the state. That's just one idea. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And I appreciate that you're kind of jumping into the engine of the sustainable funding discussion here. We're talking about, what are the base assumptions? And so Aaron, your points are not going to be lost here. But I am going to turn this back briefly, and I think everybody else, I'm guessing, is wanting just to get down to the nuts and the bolts. And but I would like to offer up a couple of amendments and test them with you, and see whether or not they work for you. So one is what I brought up earlier on, which is that with regard to the first bullet, which says across the board, people agreed that sustainable funding was necessary for an ADV program. I would suggest that that also says for short and long-term needs or funding needs. The second I would like to offer up for discussion here is user fees are seen as a primary opportunity for sustainable funding. If I'll just leave, forget the if, I'm going to put the period on. I'm going to let people kind of chime in on this. And Josh, you look like you're reaching for your button.
Yeah, I always forget where the hands up one is in Zoom. I think I had to close my chat. Yeah, there it is. And I see Rachel's hand up, and I'd love for her to respond to what Aaron had brought up before. So make sure that's not lost, because I'm interested in her input. No, I think I have no issue with the idea of an assumption being that support for any funding mechanism would be greater if there was a sense of those providing that funding, that there was some level of accountability / enforcement. I would throw back to the group a little bit that what's the funding for that enforcement that you think you want, because those things aren't necessarily completely independent. And then also how to, in the example of that Mike brought up of the individual walking away and laughing about it, whether he is criminally enforced on whatever, that doesn't address the issue of that boat at all. And so the funding mechanism still needs to be identified for that, unless we're not really concerned with ADVs. We're just concerned with prosecuting people to the greatest extent of the law. And I'm not advocating one way or another. I'd like you all to look at it from our point of view, is that regardless of the situation, there's still an old boat problem, and there's not funds available through that responsible party, whether he's pursued or not, to address it. And that's DSL's charge to protect state waters and then the uses on them. Some of that is independent of the enforcement piece. Not that I don't understand it's intrinsically linked, and to get support for it, it might need to be there. But I guess this is kind of shoehorning this into the assumptions part, Eric, but I'd like some people to understand that's a consideration from the state level.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. And definitely we can put that on board. And in fact, one of the things I was thinking after I said the two that I did is to the point that others have brought up with regard to enforcement, that this is a two-part piece with regard to sustainable funding, that sustainable funding assumes enforcement at an effective level. So, Josh?
Yeah, no, I think actually the way you just said that, I think makes sense. So I would agree that's an assumption of at least mine right now. And the other one being, I'm glad Abby brought it up, was just, I think this inherent understanding for all of us that big boats versus small boats, large complex boats with complex histories and different applications versus the small to medium-sized recreational vessels, that those are different types of situations that will need different tactics to address effectively. So I think that's an assumption that I think we've heard from the group in the past.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Josh. All right. Rachel, can I ask, is this related to the base assumptions, or did you were going to comment on what Aaron had?
It was on both.
Okay, go for it.
So the first one, for those who don't know, I represent the National Marine Manufacturers Association, and I want to assure the group that from the manufacturer's perspective, new boats being produced are looked at the long-term sustainability, but a big portion of derelict vessels will tend to be 20 or 30 years old, and it's a long line that's fully encompassing. So I just want to assure everyone that manufacturers are looking at what we can do in terms of sustainability and where we're looking for the future, so this problem can be mitigated. And then the second portion I wanted to talk about, which Josh just touched on, was the differentiation of boats. I think will be really important when we're discussing funding related to whether or not it is a recreational vessel, is it left at a marina, for commercial vessels, for things that are dealt with the U.S. Coast Guard. Are there opportunities for partnerships and that type of sustainable funding through that? So those were the 2 points I wanted to bring up, and then that is it for me. If anyone has any additional questions on anything I just said.
Okay. Josh, you had your hand up.
I don't. I'm just incompetent at lowering my hand.
Okay. All right. So I do want to circle back, and I see Aaron. I see you have your hand up, and before we turn back to you, I'd like to I'd like to kind of recognize that, you know, one of the things that you were talking about last time does fit into an assumption, if you will, that you know, people, owners, manufacturers are that, you know, the manufacturers sell or profit from otherwise used boats should be accountable for sustainably funding the removal of ADVs. So with that, let me throw it back to Aaron and see whether or not that was resonates with you.
Sure. I just wanted to get back to your I need to return to the assignment of underlying assumptions, and so the two that I did not mention that I wanted to bring up, the ones that I thought about when I was thinking about making suggestions for this, was one is that many hands make light work. So I was looking for funding sources that could be spread out across lots of people for a smaller amount. And then the other one is that we wouldn't want to do something that, again, is so unusual, like in terms of fees or in terms of you know, fees for manufacturers or anything like that. It's so unusual that it makes our state at a disadvantage in an industry or in sales or things like that. We don't want to damage that, I think. And so those were the two assumptions that I was wanting to make.
Great, I appreciate that, and you know, I think one of the points that you're bringing up, and I saw Josh, you had a hand up, but now you're back down. So the point that I'm hearing from you is that regardless of how things roll out here with sustainable funding, what you're really looking for is enough of a distribution of sources that no one source is disproportionately hurting a population than another population related to the boating community. Would that be fair?
That's correct. In addition to that idea would be that I guess not more one more than the other, but proportionately to their level of, you know, so like if I'm just a taxpayer and I don't even have a boat and I was going to be required to somehow fund this, then my funding should be really tiny. If I was a taxpayer who owns a boat and I'm going to at some point, you know, be using my boat, then maybe my portion is a little bit large. You see what I'm saying? It's somehow related to the involvement of how that boat winds up there or the activity associated with it, whatever.
Yeah, proportionality is really important here. Okay, great. Josh?
Yeah, I had an observation, and then I wanted to give everyone an idea of, you know, I thank you for the time putting into developing these assumptions. Because if you've ever seen, you know, a proposed bill or piece of legislation, usually up front you see a whole lot of whereas statements. And I'd like to establish that background for anything that we propose. So whereas these, so it's helpful for me to hear the group work through these, just to, you know, saying basically the things that we, at least as this group, now we're certainly not representative of all Oregonians, maybe not even all stakeholders on this issue. But at least for this group, we've established that these are some baselines. So that's the reasoning for this conversation. And then just an observation from, you know, previous and current experience. You know, boat building, boat use really, but especially boat building and selling is such a national enterprise. It is not limited to states. Most of the boats that we're dealing with here in Oregon, I've never really done this analysis, but very few of them are actually created in Oregon. And then also looking at Oregon's recreational boating industry versus those that I'm a whole lot more familiar with in some of the East and South, where that's, you know, fiberglass watercraft and you know, the boat industry looks different depending on which part of the country that you're in. So I'm happy for the group to discuss anything involving, you know, manufacturers' involvement, or, you know, looking at something at the time of sale. Just understand that, you know, a lot of the boats built in Oregon are metal boats built for the Northwest. I would guess Oregon's a net. I'm not gonna, that's for Rachel to talk on. I'm not gonna talk about the boating industry here, but just be aware that, you know, I don't know how much impact you could have on a statewide boating manufacturer thing, understanding that there's boats being built in probably 49 other states that also find themselves in our waters.
Okay. Rachel?
I can just quickly touch on what Josh was saying. So I know that there are 6 manufacturers that are members of ours in the state of Oregon, but we have I believe it's over, I want to say close to 1,000 members throughout all 50 states. And I know the state of Oregon individually has much more than the like 6 or 7 members that we have. So that's just a quick add-in.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Aaron?
Another one another underlying assumption that I kind of that is one that I forget to mention because I just take it for granted, and that's that I believe that private industry is very industrious when in fixing complex problems like this, when it's economically incentivized for them to do so. So I look toward private industry for a lot of this stuff to come up with solutions, which is again another reason why I think that if we can either involve somebody, because I guarantee you there are parts of boats and ships and all kinds of stuff that are underutilized, that if we could figure out a way to arrange the situation so that people are forced a little bit more to really look at those as a resource and how to use that they might be able to find an economically beneficial solution where it actually makes sense to use some of these as a source of supply for something else. And I think we should work toward that way, because then you don't have to, you arrange things so that industry can take care of the problem creatively and in a way that makes some money, creates jobs and everything else.
Okay. Great, thank you, Aaron. Troy, hear from you for the first time today. Oh, I'm sorry, Josh, did you have something? Your hand's still up. Okay.
Okay, Troy Wood, Washington Department of Natural Resources, Derelict Vessel Program Manager. I had a question for Josh. Does Oregon require titled vessels to register in Oregon? Titled vessels through the U.S. Coast Guard Documentation Center?
Yes.
Okay.
So any documented vessel, unless they are being used for commercial purposes and have those credentials, then it must be registered as a recreational vessel and have a sticker different than what a normal rec vessel would be. But yes, there is that requirement.
Okay, because that would make a difference if you were going to attach user fees to registration. So, thank you.
All right, I'm also reading here in the chat, and Stephanie, you raised a question about whether or not there's been an assumption or goal identified about how much funding is needed or desired annually for the program. And Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not a number that we're looking at right now.
No, there's not. We touched on some of this at early discussions, and I kind of brought it up earlier in this discussion today. Ideally, I guess in a perfect world, we would have the set number of what's needed and then start working backwards from there and figuring out how to get that. I think the reality is right now that number is pretty big. We know that it's pretty big, and it's bigger than I think can feasibly be achieved right now. So the short answer to your question, absolutely not. There's certainly been some ideas, tossed around here. What would it take to be able to get ahead of the highest priority vessels, or start to make a dent in the inventory? Even that are in very kind of rudimentary estimates. We'll have to do some of that analysis, certainly, as we justify a legislative concept that might have sources identified, what that could be used for. But that's, in some ways, that's a conversation for a little bit further down the road.
Okay. All right. I think we are kind of sort of wrapping up, I think, the assumption piece. But before we do that, we've had a core group of folks here who've been pretty vocal. And I'm just wondering, is there anybody out there here online that in the work group that has some thoughts, yay, nay, indifferent, that you'd like to share? I don't get paid on commission by how many people talk, but I do like to hear as many as we can.
Well, I will provide a pitch real quick to if there's anything out there. Because again, these assumptions will form the base of, hey, we all seem to agree on this. I really don't want to find that some of these things we didn't actually all agree on, and then that to come out further down the road. So I encourage people to speak up if there are things that have been said here that you might disagree with, because there's a reason that all of you have been asked to participate in this process.
So while folks are looking for the hand button, because I know there are a number of you right now trying to find that button, let me just kind of reiterate what I've got so far on the list. And I see your hand, Troy. Hang on. So with regard to sustainable funding being necessary, we talked about that is inherent of short and long-term needs. We also have the one we haven't brought up again since it was presented, which is pursuing grant funding is important, but it's not sustainable. We also had a discussion about the need for whatever sustainable funding framework is put together, that there is proportionality with regard to the impact of the issue and the impact of appropriate allocation to the different participants in this issue. Then there was also the discussion about the balance between making sure that sustainable funding is balanced with effective enforcement, and making sure that that's not lost in the discussion with regard to funding. And as someone pointed out, you can't go asking for funding if you're actually not enforcing what needs to be addressed. And then the last one I threw out, and I didn't get any kind of kickback on this, but I'm just going to toss it out again, and that is that any sustainable funding strategy should be including user fees in some form, but not necessarily exclusively. So I just tossed that out. I didn't get a reaction last time, and I thought I might. So we'll go to Troy first.
Thank you. So about sources of funding, I would recommend that you put in your statutes that you have an account created for your program and it's administered by you and your agency, but more importantly, that it can receive gifts, grants, or private funding from other sources and stuff like that, because that'll make the program a little bit more malleable as to where it can get the funding. But more importantly, if you ever do a vessel turn-in program, they can make a donation to your program, even though it may not cover the cost of the destruction of the vessel. they can still donate as much as they can or make it hurt for them or something like that from private citizens. I'm just thinking about the adaptability is all. Thank you.
Great. Good advice, Troy. Thank you. Mike?
So on the user fee, I just want to put on record, I support that idea, but I'm going to say to an extent, right? It needs to be reasonable. I am curious how, I see a user fee, and I know we're not really talking about the how right now, but I get back to the commercial and the federally documented vessels that aren't required to get state registered. What does that look like in a user fee program? How do they pay? Commercial versus recreational, how do they pay? And I'll kind of bounce this. I know in our last in-person meeting, Troy talked about certain size vessels and a requirement to have them surveyed. If Troy has an opportunity to kind of talk about that a little bit, because this gets back to, and I hate to keep bouncing back to it, but how do we avoid people doing this? And part of the problem is that I see here in the marina is that these boats should get passed and passed and passed. And we heard the sergeant talk about it. By the time you catch up and you find this boat derelict or sunk, that the last registered owner was, years and years ago down the pile. I mean, we get it all the time here at the marina. We just dealt with one that we hauled out of the water. It's sitting out of the water. A guy claimed he was the owner. 4 other people claimed they were the owner for 6 months. Finally, he somehow got a hold of the title. I question whether it's all legitimate, but he was able to get it registered with the Marine Board. Now he wants his boat back to put it back in the water and probably let it go derelict and sink on the bottom. So we are insisting that he pays all his fees. He can't afford to pay the fees. So for now, that boat is safe, sitting on the hard. But it's that whole transfer of ownership that is a real problem for these vessels. And how do we change that? It's like our vehicles, right? In this state, if you sell a vehicle, I don't know how often that's enforced. Maybe the sergeant can chime in here, but you have to report that you sold that vehicle within so many days, and if you don't, that could be a violation. We need the same thing for boats. I don't know that boats have that same requirement here. But we've got to figure out ways also to avoid this transfer of these derelict boats. Look, we're not finding boats that are 10 years old or newer sitting on the bottom. That's not our issue. It's these 40, 50, 60-year-old boats that are just getting passed on and getting sold for $1 in a bar. Those are our problem children. And we've got to figure out how we can stop that as part of this problem. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate that. And Stephanie had brought up a similar thought. Stephanie Rosson from Metro, and I see Dorothy, you've responded to that. So let's move on to Sean.
Yeah, I just kind of want to add, because I mean, obviously I figured user fees are going to be a source at some point, and I think it is a good way to get a lot of people, more people, paying as opposed to, less numbers. But looking at that, and I know there's a lot of different types of ways to have user fees, but one of the ones sounds like people lean towards, and I saw on the pie chart was, like launch fees or things like that. But we also need to look at, the efficiency of collecting funds and the enforcement of that. So, and again, this is just one method, but if I look at, like, let's say a launch fee, where I typically see those as a county or a city boat ramp where you have local people right there that can enforce that. If we have a statewide program that has a launch fee, is the city of Portland, for example, going to pay its people to go, look through the parking lot and see if people are paying those launch fees, or Multnomah County, or, what I'm getting at is just, in other words, if we're spending, if we're collecting $100, we need to find ways that we're not spending $40 to collect that $100, as an example.
Yeah, so we need some cost efficiencies here. Not putting good money after bad. Okay, so great. Thank you, Sean. Troy?
This goes to the enforcement side of that. In Washington State, we hold the last registered owner responsible for the vessel cost of removal and everything like that. But we also added into that a person who intentionally, through action or inaction without the appropriate state local authorization, could be held accountable for the abandoned or derelict vessel as well. So that might help alleviate the problem of trying to find an owner 5 owners ago to be responsible for the vessel today. If you can find the person who abandoned or derelict the vessel today, you could charge them under that statute. Thank you.
Good clarification. Josh?
A couple of follow-ups to, I think, the last 2 points, and then I know you had a break introduced here at I think 2, and I want to get to that, so give people some time. One to you, Troy, from something earlier. In the bill that set up the ADV account in the Treasury, all those flexibilities that you suggested were put in there. So we have a step up on that, and the fund can be used in many flexible ways, and it also can get contributions in many ways. So some of that's done. I wanted to respond to what Sean said, and I'm glad you said it, Sean, because I want to encourage the group. We've talked about kind of through this already, boat registration fees and taxes or fees on the sale of boats. We a little bit touched on leases and stuff. I would encourage the group to think about streams that may already be able to be tapped into versus introducing new mechanisms. There certainly is a precedent for a fee on the sale of all boats in the state, in a state, but that's not set up in Oregon, right? We don't even have a sales tax. So thinking about, I have no idea how complicated it would be to collect, $1 million from that. It might be one of those, you spend 500,000 to collect a million. So just a consideration for folks.
Great. Well, let's get Chris in, and then Mark, and then let's take a break. So, Chris.
And just thinking, one of the things we heard earlier is we don't really know a number we're trying to track for. Seems like that's someone should put their head around, are we looking for 5 million a year, 10 million a year? Because it seems like all these fees and where we get them doesn't really make sense if we're not trying to get to something. A launch fee where they charge you $5 to launch your boat, and take an awful lot of launches to get anywhere down the road. Sale of your vessel, such as a sales fee, that might get somewhere. But I think, where we've heard the registration fee, that's already really well set up to get the boating community. This is sort of a shared type concept. And I don't know how many registered boats there are in the state of Oregon, but if we had a number, say $5 million, and we got, 100,000 boats, well, now we sort of can get towards where fee might, what is that fee? But I guess that's the thing. I think the group needs to come up with, well, what is our goal? We've got a couple $1 million. We got, a couple $1 million now. We'd like to generate at least $1 or $2 million a year to take care of this. I think we've sort of got the cart before the horse, it sounds like to me, but it's just my comment.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate the comment on that. And I think, and I'm going to turn to Josh to ask me whether or not what I'm about to say is incorrect, but I think DSL is in a position where it's having to design the car and decide how much it needs to be able to do, and then how fuel efficient it is, what kind of fuel you're going to use in it, all in one sort of fell swoop. And so this is a situation where you've got you don't have as much time to be able to take each segment sequentially. But Josh, why don't you talk to that, if you would?
Yeah, that's not an easy one. I view the having sustainable funding for the state to have capacity to administer this program, to seek federal funds, to provide assistance to those other jurisdictions that may be affected, to look out for the state's interests as it pertains to the waterways. That starts to become a little bit easier to quantify. That last part, less so, right? I mean, how much appetite is there for the state to spend $50 million of taxpayer money on removals of big boats? Is it 5? Is it 25? That you can't disconnect. Chris, you're not wrong. You can't disconnect the question of how much should we spend or how much, is the state willing to spend. You're always prioritizing the public's resources for many different issues, those, ADVs and certainly those well outside of that. So anyway, I can see, the program being sustained at maybe a lower level, but as long as there's capacity to seek federal funds, to leverage other funds, maybe that is what the program looks like in maybe the short term. I don't know, but you bring up a good question that it's impossible for me to answer.
Okay, well, that's what we do, Josh. We give you the impossible questions. So
Sure, I appreciate it.
yeah. Okay. Thank you. So Chris, your hand's still up, but I think you're just stretching, right? Okay, yeah, he went away. Okay. Not totally away, please don't. So Mark, and then let's go to a break after that. I'm sorry, Mike, but there's a point where we have to give people a bio break here. So Mark?
Yeah, Mark with the public ports again. I would just note that for boat registrations, that's only the recreational boats that are out there. So there's another real big segment of the vessels that would be unaffected by a registration fee for recreational vessels. So I just wanted to point out the obvious, to note that all those commercial vessels would not be included in a boat registration fee scenario, and want to make sure that we don't lose that and ensure that we include them as well. Thank you.
And Mark, I think that sort of inherently falls within the proportionality piece that we were talking about earlier, about how the sources are drawn. So thank you very much. All right, Mike, hold that thought. We're going to take a bio break for 5 minutes. My clock says 2:04, so we'll come back at 2:09. Thanks. All right, we're waiting for people to gather back. I know that was a really quick break. Wait till I see a couple more cameras come on just to know people are coming back. Thanks, Abby. And hi, Troy. Excellent. Aaron, great. By the way, thanks for turning your cameras on when you're able to. It helps me as a facilitator just to be able to see everybody. So I do appreciate that if you can. Okay, so let's continue on, and what I'd like to do is just I'd like to just transition into talking about the different types of sustainable funding and move on from the assumptions. The assumptions, we weren't trying, I think as Josh mentioned, we weren't trying to get to consensus necessarily, but enough that DSL has a pretty good sense of where you folks are coming from with regard to the guidelines for sustainable funding. And I think we've had a pretty good discussion, and not everybody's in full agreement, but at the same time, I think we've got a pretty good sense for the DSL folks. So, all right, I'm going to go to Mike, and Mike, if you have something else on the assumptions, that's fine. Or if you have something on the different types of sustainable funding, that's fine too. So, what have you got? Maybe Mike didn't make it back. All right, Josh.
Sure, I'm happy to fill time until Mike does get back, but let's make sure that we give him the opportunity. I'd like to revisit the last thing that Mr. Landauer said, and I appreciate him bringing up the topic of we can talk about boat registration fees all we want, that's fine. The boats that are incurring giant costs to the state, to ports, to marinas, to the people of the state as a whole, often aren't in that boat that's currently registering with the state. So Mark, I guess my question for you is, what makes the most sense to you, where to introduce some sort of funding mechanism or fee or whatever you want to call it, to capture those boats that aren't currently being registered? Because there's, with the smaller ones, for better or for worse, there's already a mechanism established. Like, how would you go about in your perfect world, I guess, in getting those funds from that group that you are, I think, correctly saying is not necessarily paying into the cleanup costs, to the state for purposes of ADV prevention and removal? And that doesn't necessarily have to be a question just for Mark. It can be for the group, because I admittedly know less about, what we say commercial traffic, or even just, very large boat traffic registered with the Coast Guard. That falls outside of a lot of state control. And so how might that, best be brought into the state system, if you will?
Anybody like to tackle that? Rachel?
Yeah, hi. So I don't think I have a great answer for this, but I do know this is something the state of California struggles with. Their recreational vessel fee is directly put into their ADV program, yet the ADV program in California can go for both recreational and commercial vessels. So I know a couple of years ago, they removed a large commercial vessel and essentially drained the ADV fund, and that upset a lot of recreational boaters who were paying into this with their fees, and it didn't really address any of the other problems throughout the state of California. So I do know that this is a problem that a lot of states are trying to figure out, and I don't know if maybe Washington State does something different, but I think it is good to mention the state of California, to maybe look to them or ask questions to like Ramona, the BLA down there, and see if they had the opportunity to do it again, how they would potentially make it different.
Great, Josh. Oh, okay.
I'm
So
sorry, that'd be the last time. I'm trying to write things down, and I'm navigating the hand is slipping my mind.
Navigation, no pun intended. Okay. Let's circle back to Mike briefly, see if he's there now. Mike, you there? Okay. Anybody else want to come back to this issue? Okay. All right. So let's, oh, Sergeant.
Yeah, I like the idea. Again, we've got to work with the waterway users themselves. They're the responsible ones for helping ensure the safety and the beauty of what we have statewide remains that way for years to come and for generations to come. So it's got to be incorporated into the sale and the registration of vessels.
Okay. So that's where you would like to go is into sales and then registration of vessels, recreational and commercial.
Recreational and commercial.
Okay.
I have a difficult time with saying the boat manufacturers are per se responsible. If somebody were to be swimming from aside the vessel, do we blame the vessel manufacturer for the drowning if that were to occur? So yeah, again, it's not the vessel itself that is the issue here. It is our users that are the issues.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Did you have a follow-up to that or something else? Chris?
And somewhat following Steve, but I wanted to point out, we keep talking about, well, the ones who are causing the problem aren't paying the registration. At one point, the boat was, and I guess we're talking more in pleasure craft. At one time, someone was paying the registration, and those funds go into a building fund. I think we're trying to disconnect people that aren't paying a registration as causing the problem, and registered boats aren't. I think the people that register their boats are helping build a fund to take care of, quote, the community. And so when those no longer are paying the fee and their boat, it becomes, a problem. Well, that's the people who are buying the current registrations are taking care of the current problem. So thanks.
Great. Mike, are you back?
Yep, I'm back. Sorry about that. So my question, I'm curious if, and I know you guys are pretty young at DSL here with this program, but has an analysis been done of the boats that are the problem? And when I say that is, we're talking about registration, user fees, those types of things. Who are we going after? In my experience, your smaller trailable boats, as far as removing these things from the water, are not our problem. That's not the largest problem. It's a very small percentage of the problem. And where I'm going with this is I don't think we can do this in a vacuum as we look for ways to fund this, whether it's through registration or user fees, and hit on, I guess I'll say, everybody equally. I don't think I think commercial should be a higher rate. You got to look at this as, you got these vessels that are much larger, take much larger equipment to come in and remove, versus you got somebody that's got a trailable boat that's 20 foot. You can throw a couple of airbags under it and get it out. Very simple to get out. I'm not saying easy and no cost, but much easier than a larger vessel. So have we done any type of analysis of over the last few years with Oregon State Marine Board's program? I know Dorothy's on the call. Do we know size of vessels, even years of vessels? Do we have that data?
Dorothy, did you want to tackle that, or Josh?
Or do you want to?
Well, go ahead, Dorothy.
So I don't know if I would call it an analysis, but I've definitely observed a lot of trends over the years. With most of the vessels that the Oregon State Marine Board has handled, either directly because we went out and proactively located vessels and worked with partners to remove vessels, or because we used the salvage vessel sub-account to reimburse, whether it's law enforcement or local parks department, in addressing a vessel that they had to deal with because it was in the middle of the boat ramp or whatever. In general, those are your 20 to 30 foot fiberglass boats built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I would say if I had to describe like my perfect ADV that I dealt with the most at the Marine Board, it was probably a 1975 fiberglass sailboat. Those turned up all over the place, and we dealt with a whole bunch of those. Even with the grant program that we did with the ports, we got some bigger boats that way because those were boats that had been moored long-term on the water. But still, most of those fell in that 30-foot range, fiberglass boats, lots of sailboats because they're difficult to deal with. But then again, the Marine Board was focusing on those boats at the same time, because with $150,000 per biennium, it wouldn't have made sense for our ratepayers or to spread out the amount of assistance that we could provide statewide for us to go and spend $75,000 removing one big boat. So we didn't. So it's kind of hard to describe, what the impact would be if, we had had a much larger fund and had been open to addressing some of those bigger boats, but we just didn't. We wanted to help the local governments and our law enforcement partners as much as possible. And so, I would say that most of our boats were those boats that I just described.
And real quick follow-up, Dorothy, and those were ones that were on the water and you had to retrieve them, or they were dumped somewhere, like on land?
So we avoided as much as possible addressing any boats that were dumped on land. As close as we got to dealing with boats on land was if something was dumped right in the middle of the ramp, or if it, washed up at high tide and was beached, or on a riverbank when the water receded. But I mean, these were boats. I mean, I know that a lot of them were dumped, but they were dumped straight into the water at a boat ramp. A lot of them probably also had been moored long-term on the water. A lot of them came straight out of marinas and then drifted down and sank someplace. And so we ended up dealing with those. I don't know that I really have specific records on like the backstory of the boats, like where exactly they came from, but the characteristics of the boats, all of that was recorded for every boat that I was involved in. And that includes boats that the Marine Board didn't necessarily have to expend funds on, but boats that law enforcement partners contacted me about and wanted ownership information or just advice on how to deal with a boat. And in a lot of cases, they were able to avoid the state having to become responsible for that boat. But all of those boats kind of fit that profile.
Thanks again, Dorothy. And Mike, I want to go back to your original statement and appreciate Dorothy's insights with regard to what you're bringing up. But one of the things that I thought I heard you say is that, and I'm going to rephrase this in a different way, as you look at an algorithm, if you will, for sustainable funding and things that you factor into that. Part of what you're suggesting is you should make it as data driven as you can in putting together that sustainable funding algorithm, if you will, if you have the data to be able to do that. Would that be a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. We need, this is back to defining the problem. and root cause of our issue. So where is our real problem? What's our target audience? I'm not saying that you don't have the one-offs, but I know there was, we talked earlier about, different vessels and, what's being what's being manufactured today, but the reality, and you just heard it from Dorothy, is it's the older vessels that are our problems. Those are the ones that are getting passed around. That's the problem. The problem is not a 5-year-old boat that somebody just paid $200,000 for. The problem is a 40, 50-year-old boat that's not worth $1 that's on the water. And how do we get after prevention? How do we get to preventing those from ending up on the bottom?
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Josh?
I see Chris just put his hand up. I'll defer to him. I have a kind of almost a devil's advocate type thing that I'd like to put out to the group. But Chris, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Chris Hathaway, Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. And just as we have all these discussions, it feels like we almost have two programs. There's the recreational vessel program where there seems logical funding sources and a logical way to collect that money and a fairly straightforward program that could be developed. And then we have the larger commercial vessels that are way more complex, way more expensive. And those we don't seem to have a logical way to collect money to build an account for, because there's no registration fees in Oregon for those sort of commercial vessels, it sounds like. And I don't know enough about the operation of those vessels, but I would wonder if there's some other fees or licensing that they are paying to the state, and that if through that mechanism, they could contribute to a pot that could build to help remove those vessels at some point.
All right, so again, another point being made with regard to how do you capture the commercial vessels that are also having a large impact here, just by virtue of size, at least. So Troy?
So this problem plagues Washington as well. We used to have a budget of $2.5 million, and we would remove primarily the smaller vessels and stuff like that. We went after the watercraft excise tax, and that gave us a biennium budget of $10.3 million. And then we had a rash of large boats. So we have one boat that's 170 foot long right now that we had to take emergency temporary possession of it because it was over a Superfund site and it was sinking. Estimation on how much to dispose of that boat runs between $5 and $10 million. So my program would effectively be over for the rest of the biennium, which it just started 6 months ago, if that one vessel was taking up most of my budget. So your budget questions are valid, but no matter how much money you get in the program initially, it's not going to be enough. But that's where you have to collect the data, go to the legislature, plead your case for more funding in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Troy. Josh, did you have something related to that, or you wanted to pose your question?
Well, in many ways, Chris posed the question for me, so it was a perfect segue. Back to what Troy said, I appreciate that kind of pointing out. Yes, that acknowledgement that no matter how much we start with, it's not going to be enough, at least enough in some people's minds to address the extent of the problem. So I just, to me, that's a painful reality that I think we all need to be aware of. But I was going to bring up the same thing that Chris had done. Whether the commercial or big, past their use military boats, whether they're in recreational use technically or not, but the older boats that Dorothy kind of identified as the problem, the ones that I'm sure many of the port folks identify as the problems. It's not completely lost on me that they are contributing money somewhere. I mean, whether it's moored, well, usually it's moorage fees, launch fees, very rarely, usually they're in the water, they stay in the water. Is there potential to tap into some of those those mechanisms that are in place. Maybe they're not with the state, but where can the state, facilitate either private marinas or ports for being more ready to account for these situations? Is that potentially another direction to go? And then I also just want to acknowledge and I'm glad we're identifying that, look, the problem with the smaller recreational boats and bigger commercial or ex-military or recreational, commercial, whatever boats, those are certainly different. But I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that the impacts from a lot of those big boats are not felt just by, maybe even not at all, by the commercial or big boat industry. A lot of those impact recreational boaters and local economies. So I wouldn't completely untie those issues as A and B. Certainly they might be two different parts of the program, but don't lose sight of the fact that A does indeed affect B. But anyway, back to that question on how do you tap into where these bigger boats are already contributing. I'd like to hear ideas here, because I think it's been pointed out correctly. Like it's cleaner for the boats that already have some sort of requirement with the state. If again, we're all seeming to be gravitating toward this idea that users are contributing in some way. And I also would just put out there that users might not be limited to just boaters. I'm not necessarily saying that's not the best direction to go, but think about all water stakeholders too. Again, I'm just trying to populate a big list of ideas for us to then, work through. So I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Great question, especially given what's been shared so far today and in previous meetings. So does anybody want to try and tackle that in terms of, how are you addressing those larger boats? Or can you address those? Fair enough, Josh? You look like you're going to press the button again.
Yeah, but it wasn't going to be a raise the hand button. I was just trying to bring up the chat. But yeah, there are other ways to bring them into the fold, so to speak.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle that? It doesn't have to be the perfect answer. Stan.
Well, it's Stan Tonneson, Rocky Point Marina, and board member of WOO. These are just off the cuff here. Fishing licenses might be one thing. I think they all have a fishing license they pay into on a regular basis. And secondly, I travel all over the world on commercial vessels, and I get dinged a port fee every place I go. So there's a fee that the port is charging for our vessel to be in port. So those are two mechanisms I can think of. And I'd like to just throw something in that's a little bit off subject, but it's in the DSL's department. We had a marina closed down about 3 or 4 years ago and kicked out 50 to 100 derelict boats to clean out. And that really created a big mess into our community here in the Portland area. And if we could address that issue, to stop that from happening, because there's nothing illegal about evicting every tenant you have in your marina. So I'd just like to throw that out there. It's off our subject right now, but it was a problem.
Appreciate that. We can kind of put that into a parking lot list here to come back to. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. And that, yeah, so you're suggesting that, fishing licenses, port fees are ways to be able to address.
Yeah, I mean, that's all that comes to mind.
What's that?
Yeah, that's all that comes to my mind is something where they're paying a fee into already, where there's a funding mechanism.
Yeah.
Potential.
Josh?
So in some ways, this is kind of unfair a conversation to have without Mark Landauer. But I guess my question for the other port folks, is there any merit in this idea that instead of looking for the state to collect a fee that is then, indirectly or directly available to you for ADV type issues, is there a cleaner, more two-party system there where the state, and I don't know what this would look like, but support the I guess just collection of fees or something like that so that you're better equipped to address these problems and the state provides some sort of higher level support. I mean, I think I'm oversimplifying something incredibly nuanced, but I'd like to hear your input because that's kind of the idea that's being proposed.
Aaron?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron Bretz from the Port of Newport. I think it's possible. I think I actually had suggested that, mortgage fees could be one place to collect this sort of thing. And one thing about it though is that it could be difficult. It's important to understand that most of the public ports, I'll speak on behalf of the Port of Newport. We get about 2 or 3% of our operating budget from property taxes in our tax districts. So we're not a very tax funded entity. Most of it is fees that have to roll right into the maintenance of the facility. So the reason why I bring that up is I don't know how far reaching outside, I don't know how far you could get, because one thing that we would seek to do is if we're going to contribute to a state fund, then we're going to want to get pretty quick state reaction when we got an issue that we got to get cleaned up. And so I don't know how far outside of the local port you'd be able to fund, I don't know what the landscape looks like. Maybe it could work on a broader scale. But I think it's definitely a funding point. Now, you mentioned collections. We don't do very well at collections. And so the folks who abandon boats are the same ones that we have problems with paying their fees and everything else. And I think if we could get better support, maybe it would provide some kind of impetus for there to be more support for ports in general to collect fees. And I think that would be a definite benefit to the ports. But yeah, it's possible, I suppose. I just don't know how far you get with it.
Right. Thanks, Aaron. Josh?
Yeah, no, let me follow up on that because I'm intrigued. Thank you for your answer, Aaron. I wasn't necessarily even thinking about it. Wow, look at all the hands go up. I wasn't necessarily thinking about it as even some sort of core state fund that is then available. But is there something that we could do at the state level to facilitate? I mean, one could argue there is a need for more money everywhere, whether it's at state level, whether it's local level, port level, to address this issue that we all acknowledge is fairly difficult to take care of and very expensive. I mean, could the state do things? Could state lands do things that might help the port? I'm not necessarily saying that they need to increase fees to address ADVs at the port. That's, again, oversimplifying it. But are there things that we could do outside of, trying to collect some sort of state fee that might help them move the needle on this?
Right. Mike, you want to
So
take on that question, or?
if I'm kind of tracking, are you thinking, as Aaron was talking, are you thinking almost, I'm going to compare it to a lodging tax? Are you talking like there's going to be a percentage tax on mortgage fees that's dictated by the state? So if you come in just like a lodging tax and you come to stay for a night, you're getting charged a lodging tax. The same thing would be for a mortgage. You come in and you stay, there's a percentage fee tacked onto your mortgage. Is that what you're talking about?
No, not necessarily, because that implies that it's a state kind of mandate. I mean, if it was something, would state support for an increased port fee that goes into an account, and maybe there's a way to leverage state support then if that account for the Port of Coos Bay exists. Tell me where this idea breaks down.
Well, where do you get the money from to fund that? I'm not tracking.
I guess that I'm trying to turn it back to where do you get money out of, if we're saying that the big boat mortgage is something that we want to look at. What stops the port from some sort of mortgage fee increase and that percentage go into some sort of account or something dedicated to this issue for the port?
What stops us is we have a community of folks that have habitually over decades been able to pay almost nothing for mortgage. And the second we try to charge more, the pitchforks are going to come out.
No, and I understand the politics thing. I appreciate the honest answer.
I mean, that is what's going to happen. I think I've said to this group before. You go to the East Coast, you'll pay quadruple for an annual or a monthly slip than what folks pay for out here.
All right, thanks. Troy, what's your thought on that?
Really don't have a solution for helping the ports other than generating funds on the state level and making them an authorized public entity for the removal of vessels and where they can get reimbursed for that. I mean, that's what we do here. It increases our team and stuff like that. But for generating the funds and stuff, a mechanism that you have in the state right now is you register vehicles. So we pay our Department of Licensing about $33,000 a biennium to collect the fees from the registration of vessels. And I don't know if something like that could be set up in Oregon.
Okay. Don't know the answer to that question, but that's a good suggestion to talk about. Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so on the topic of raising mortgage fees for any purpose, it could be this one, but I think it's important when you go to do this. It's important. We've had some success with it here. You have to go to the users and understand what the impacts are exactly. So what you'll hear is a lot of larger commercial boats will say, you're going to put us out of business, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, I'm looking right now at the West Coast. This is a report that NOAA does every, I think, 2 or 3 years, the Catcher Vessel Report. You can grab these statistics. They publish industry stats on what the average fishing business pays in their expenses and what it's allocated to. Moorage is the absolute lowest of all of their costs. Like you're talking about, this is basically raising moorage for commercial boats is kind of like raising the price of bread at the grocery store. You don't pay it well. Nowadays you pay a lot more for bread, but think of an essential thing that you need that you don't pay that much for. That if you raise it a little bit, it's not going to break the bank. It's not going to make anybody go out of business. And if they claim that, they're probably not in business to begin with, because even for let's say you're going to raise 75-foot vessels moorage by $1,500 a year. Look at what that 75-foot vessel pays in one fuel bill, and then think about how many times they fill up. $1,500 is nothing. And understanding that and being able to demonstrate that you understand it, because once you start talking like that, people get a little bit sheepish about claims that you're really trying. What it's really about is how you can bring the benefit back to the person who's paying a fee. You got to be able to get that benefit to come back to them. And I think that's where the challenge here is when you're like, well, we're going to get rid of some derelict vessels. Depending on how big the problem is locally, they may or may not be supportive of it, and it could be a real problem coming back. But I don't know. That's what I understand.
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron, and some really good points there with regard to being able to show the benefit and what it's going to for those that are having to pay the fee, and then also just in terms of doing the doing the education there, and making sure that you're meeting supply and demand. In other words, are you pricing it at a price, so to speak, that works for the market that you're going for? So, okay, great, thank you, Mike.
So I just want to follow up with one comment what Aaron said, and I think that we have to be very careful, because I don't know that we have the stomach to do something like we're discussing. I am sure Aaron will echo what I'm about to say, that the coastal ports in this state are falling apart. And if we're going to increase moorage significantly or at all, it's going to be to fix the millions of dollars worth of infrastructure that hold these boats to the dock. And I just don't think there's going to be a whole lot of stomach to do something like this and add a surcharge or a charge onto it. If we're going to do that, we need to do it to repair our infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Josh? And we're gonna have to go to community comment here in just a moment, but, oh, your hand just went down?
No, it's still up. Thank you. I certainly hear what both Aaron and Mike are saying, and I understand that situation. I also know that quite a few folks had suggested looking at leases of submerged lands as a mechanism that DSL could tap into, and we haven't talked about that too much. That there was a limited number of folks that wanted that, but that would maybe in some ways be an indirect cost to a port, at least those that lease land. So I don't know if, does that affect the users in the same way, just through a different mechanism? I don't know. I have a question though for Stan. So the public ports are a small subgroups of marinas and morages in the state. They have some inherent powers being ports, able to charge fees, pseudo government entities. But for the vast majority of the private morages, all these solutions were pretty public port based. Stan, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how something like that could be administered, but in the private sector.
Wasn't ready to answer that question, Josh, but I did, and
I wasn't
will
ready to
answer
ask
it.
it, so I'm sorry.
That's okay. I did want to point out, it's always been a pet peeve that ports charge about 50% less than private marinas. They're subsidized, and so they attract, in many cases, a lesser value boat. But regardless, they're competing with private enterprise at half the fees. So there's room to move up. Could a private marina do something? Yeah, if we got taxed and we're required to do it, it's possible. I think it'd be easier through registrations rather than the boats in the water, but doable. And we all want to pitch in our fair share and have clean waterways. Does that answer your question, Josh?
Yeah, and sorry for the lack of prompt there. We were speaking just so much about one sector of morages. I want to make sure that I hear from all of them.
All right.
Okay.
So at this point, I see 3 hands up, but we do want to honor the commitment here to allowing for community input. So Aaron, Chris, and Sergeant Dangler, and if you could hold off for a moment and let's check in with community members that are on board here. So if there's anyone here that is not on the work group, and you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand, and I'll call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. And when it's your turn to speak, make sure to say your name and where you're from and any interest or organization you're representing, and you will have a total of 2 minutes to give your comments. So do we have anybody that's not on the work group here? Oh, sorry, Glenn.
Yeah, hi everybody. Glenn Dolphin with the Oregon State Marine Board. I just have a comment, that we've talked about raising fees on recreational boaters as a easy way to go, and it's not an easy path. Recreational boaters generally aren't all that excited about their fees being raised. Josh and Dorothy know these issues, these topics, these sentiments. There's other programs in the Marine Board, like the one that I also am involved with, Aquatic Invasive Species, that charges boaters a fee, $1.25 a year for motorized boaters, $2.50 for the 2-year biennium. And those don't raise all that much money. $500,000 a year or biennium. And so there's only 165,000 registered boats in Oregon recreationally. You'd have to raise the fee pretty significantly if you're going to try and raise the dollars you're talking about here. And so it really needs to be a multi-pronged funding approach, not just relying on recreational boaters to try and flip the bill for millions of dollars a year to address this issue, which I'm very supportive. And Josh and Dorothy know that, of this issue being addressed. And so I'm just cautioning the group that raising fees on recreational boaters through the registration process is not an easy way to go for funding. And it really have to be a strong case for majority of recreational boaters to get on board. With a lot of people in the state, recreational boaters perceive this issue as a Portland problem. And people living in Bend and Klamath Falls are not going to be excited to pay more money to fix Portland's problem. Again, I realize the coast has a lot of these problems too. But there needs to be a multi-pronged approach for funding and not just one user group. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Is there anybody else not on the work group that would like to speak? Okay, don't see anyone, so I think we will close that portion of the agenda and let's circle back. And I still have a couple of hands raised here. Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just like what Mike said, there is speaking of the Oregon coastal ports in particular, there's a chronic problem with infrastructure out here, and it has to do with low mortgage rates, and it's hard to get them up. I do definitely recognize what Stan was talking about, where there's a huge difference between public ports and private marinas. The issue, so you have to ask yourself why is it that the mortgage rates have stayed really low, even to the point where it's hard for the port to do what the ports need to get done? It's because it has to do with the level of, like, you're not going to be able to go statewide and say, okay, all public ports raise your rates. It's a public process that's passed by the local port district. So you'll have to figure out a way to get all the port districts that you want involved with it on board with it. And at the end of the day, those rates at the port district level become political at some point, because it goes to public, it's voted on by the elected officials, and every year as part of the budget, that is a big debate. So you may or may not succeed just by virtue of the public, whether or not they want to do that. And it's all by who lives in the port district, and then of the people who live in the port district, who's actually active in the port district, which is usually a much smaller portion of them. So that means they're controlled by a much smaller group of people, just by virtue of who doesn't, of who interacts. But anyway, that's all I've got to say.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Chris?
Chris Hathaway, Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. I totally agree with what Glenn said, and I am a boat owner, and it does seem like boat owners need to be part of the solution. I do feel like it should be one component of the fee structure that enables a program. And then getting back to the commercial boats, the larger boats, I mean, it was interesting to hear like the list of mortgage is like the least cost, right? And it's like, so there are a whole bunch of other costs, and so maybe there are ways to effectively capture money from those groups through like diesel fuel taxes or something like that, where the state already has a mechanism to collect gas taxes. Maybe there's an added money to the diesel fuel tax that could help fund a program like this, or something like that.
Okay, great. All right, so being able to use an existing mechanism is helpful. Sergeant Dangler.
Yeah, just a question for Stan and some of the other private mortgages when we talk about fee increases. And I know we've brought up Department of State land permitted area. How would we differentiate between a DSL permit area and the mortgage marina area? Or do we just do it via size of vessel per each slip? What would that really look like for a private mortgage owner?
This is Stan Tonneson, Rocky Point Marina and Woo. Steve, I'm not sure how it would look. My thought was just a small increase in the DSL lease. It all goes into the general fund to cover the entire state or region. but it would also include some self-insurance. So, because our concern are boat ADVs floating into our marina and sinking at our marina. So that's the most important portion of paying that extra fee, is to have some insurance to cover what's basically an uninsurable event. Like Portland Yacht Club spent over $100,000 for one vessel that drifted up to their breakwater. So, did that answer your question, Steve? Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other comments with regard to what we've been talking about? I am going to throw out a couple of questions here in our last couple of minutes here, if you don't. I want to go back just briefly to talking about sort of the whole span of different sustainable funding sources. And that was presented, and that we heard about during the survey. And user fees were a big part, and we've talked a lot about that, of what was recommended in the survey that our firm conducted. And then state revenues was the second one that came up, whether it was through income tax or some sort of legislative appropriation or some other mechanism. Grants came up as well as submerged land leases. And I would say that those four were really kind of the top of the ones that came out of that survey. And then we had insurance assessments and a bunch of other ones, what we did hear about: more enforcement of user fees, marina owner co-op insurance, marina owner pool, scrap sales for vessels, and off-road diesel tax. And I'm not quite sure what an off-road diesel tax is, but in any case, my point being this: we've talked about a number of these today. Is there anything that's on that list that you here in the last minute or so think should be in the tool chest for sustainable funding, besides what we've talked about? Not getting a lot of traction here. Okay. All right, fair enough. Fair enough. It's my job to check with you, so I just want to make sure that we've done that. And I want DSL to get as much information as they can get as they're tackling this issue. All right, I'm watching the clock. And so what I think we better do at this point is probably segue on toward adjournment. And Josh, I know you have some closing remarks.
Yeah, very, very brief. First of all, Eric, thank you for asking that question. Obviously, this conversation today was focused around two primary sources. We got into some potential mechanisms, some of that will require further discussion and thought. But I think it's safe to say that the work group, at least this discussion, gravitated towards, a few different directions. So I appreciate that. So yeah, anyway, that was great. So for what to expect from me over the next few weeks, the conversations from the last 3 or 4 weeks, I'm looking to capture those in a document that is, I would characterize as a direction forward for this program. There'll be some specificity in there, and there'll still be some areas for, more discussion. They're left a little bit vague. Maybe, hey, looking at commercial feed, what does that exactly look like? What's the mechanism? I don't know if we're ready to suggest that, but that's what that document will look like. But I'm committed to getting to you all in the first week of January, and then I'd like to discuss at our January meeting, and hopefully we can leave that meeting with what we have put together, with some additions and edits from our next meeting. It captures, what the work group told DSL to go look into doing. Some of those things might end up, being eliminated from a proposal, if those are deemed not viable because of other things. But I want a document that says, like, hey, this has been through the work group, and this is what they think the state should do. So that's what the next meeting is going to look like. I look forward to that. And I think a lot of you are too. We've had a lot of good conversation. Now I think we all want to see what that's been leading to. And trust me, it's leading to something. So yeah, that's what January looks like. And then after that, we will start talking about some specifics on what would need to be done through the legislature at a 2025 session. And that feels like years away, but in the legislative calendar, that's like next week. So we're going to want to start on thinking about what that looks like so we can craft that concept over the course of next spring and summer, and start getting support for that, for something we can bring forward in 25. So that's what to expect going forward. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, either give me a call, send me an email. And again, I just want to truly thank everyone for participating on this. I know at times the conversation can feel scattered and we're trying to cover 1,000 things at once, and we go down rabbit holes sometimes, maybe don't cover other things as much as some would like. I get it. This is challenging. We're trying to address a really tough issue. But I appreciate you all bearing with me, bearing with us, and participating. So thank you, and I'll see you all in the new year.
Thank you.